I was standing in the basement of a decommissioned government facility outside Arlington when I first held it in my hands. A small, dense cracker that weighed almost nothing but represented everything the system never wanted you to know. The concrete walls around me were 3 feet thick, built to withstand nuclear blasts. And somewhere in the darkness behind those walls, thousands of these crackers had been stored for decades, waiting for an apocalypse that never came. The year was 1961, and while Americans were building backyard bomb shelters and watching nuclear drills on television, a team of scientists at the USDA was working on something far more radical than any missile defense system. They weren't trying to stop the bombs. They were trying to answer a different question entirely. How do you keep a nation alive when everything collapses? Not the generals, not the politicians, but the ordinary people who would be left behind when the supply chains disintegrated, when the grocery stores were looted empty, when money became worthless overnight. I became obsessed with this question 3 years ago, long before I ever heard about the 37-cent meal. I had been researching Cold War civil defense programs, reading through declassified documents that most people would find unbearably boring, when I stumbled across a reference to something called Project Food Packet. The name meant nothing to me at first, but as I dug deeper, following paper trails through the National Archives, requesting files that hadn't been touched in 40 years, I began to realize I had found something the history books had deliberately overlooked. The program started with a simple calculation. Government analysts determined that in the event of a nuclear attack, the average American family would have roughly 72 hours before their food supplies ran out. After that, chaos, riots, starvation, the complete breakdown of social order. The military had their MREs, the politicians had their bunkers stocked with canned goods, but what about everyone else? The answer, as it turned out, was sitting in a laboratory in Beltsville, Maryland, where a group of food scientists had been experimenting with something extraordinary. Now, before I go deeper into what I discovered, I need you to understand something critical. True survival isn't just about having enough calories to stay alive. It's about complete autonomy, about not depending on anyone or anything when the system fails. That's why I've put together a comprehensive guide on the best medicinal plants you can grow in your own backyard, creating your own living pharmacy that works whether the pharmacies are open or not. You'll find that guide in the first link in the description below. It's the perfect complement to what I'm about to share with you, because real independence means controlling both your food and your health. They called it a survival cracker, but that name doesn't begin to capture what it really was. This wasn't some primitive hardtack biscuit like sailors ate in the 19th century. This was the result of cutting-edge nutritional science combined with ancient preservation techniques that most modern Americans had completely forgotten. The lead scientist, a man named Dr. Harold Macy, had spent years studying how grain behaves under extreme conditions. He had traveled to the Middle East, examining how people in the harshest climates on Earth stored wheat for years without refrigeration. What he discovered changed everything. The secret was Bulgur wheat. Not regular wheat, not wheat flour, but wheat that had been parboiled, dried, and cracked, in a very specific way. This process, which originated thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia, does something remarkable to the grain. The parboiling gelatinizes the starches, the drying removes moisture that bacteria and fungi need to survive, and the cracking exposes the maximum surface area for rapid rehydration. But Dr. Macy didn't stop there. He understood that calories alone wouldn't keep people alive in a crisis. You need protein, you need fat, you need minerals that prevent the body from cannibalizing itself under stress. So he added powdered skim milk, which provided complete protein and calcium without the fat that would go rancid. Then came the crucial element that made the whole formula work: stabilized vegetable shortening. This wasn't ordinary cooking oil. This was fat that had been hydrogenated and treated with natural antioxidants to prevent oxidation for decades. The result was a cracker that delivered roughly 450 calories, 12 grams of protein, and all the essential amino acids in a package smaller than your palm, and it cost 37 cents to produce. When I first read that number in the declassified documents, I thought it was a typo. 37 cents in 1961 dollars, which adjusts to maybe $3 today. But even that misses the point. The real cost, if you made it yourself with bulk ingredients, would be even lower. I had to prove this to myself, so I did exactly that. I ordered 20 pounds of Bulgur wheat online, bought powdered milk from a restaurant supply store, and rendered my own stabilized fat using a technique I found in a 1960s food science textbook. Following the exact ratios from the declassified formula, I produced enough crackers to sustain one person for 30 days. The total cost was $63. But here's what really matters. Those crackers are still sitting in my pantry right now, 3 years later, and they're perfectly edible, no refrigeration, no special storage conditions, just Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers in a dark closet. I test them every few months, and the nutritional value hasn't degraded. The government knew this would work because they tested it exhaustively. I found records of studies where volunteers lived on nothing but these crackers and water for 90 days. They didn't just survive, they maintained their body weight, their strength, their mental clarity. The researchers were astonished. This was designed for the worst possible scenarios. Total electrical grid collapse, hyperinflation that makes food unaffordable, complete isolation from supply networks. The officials who developed this called it the miracle of the cheap calorie, and they weren't exaggerating. Imagine having a stockpile that takes up minimal space, costs less than a cup of coffee per day, and lasts for decades. That's exactly what this formula provides. And remember, if you want to complete your independence, make sure to check out that guide on medicinal plants in the first link of the description. Growing your own pharmacy is just as important as controlling your food supply. So why did this technology disappear? Why isn't every household in America keeping a supply of these crackers in their basement? The official story is that after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, the civil defense budget was cut and the program was discontinued. But I've read the internal memos, the ones that were never meant to be declassified, and the truth is more complicated. There were people in government, people in the food industry, who understood that widespread knowledge of this formula would be catastrophic for the system that depends on your dependence. Think about what happens if every family can produce a year's worth of emergency food for less than $1,000. Think about what happens when people realize they don't need the grocery stores, don't need the supply chains, don't need to live in fear of the next shortage or the next price spike. That kind of independence is dangerous to a system built on consumption and control. So the crackers were quietly removed from the civil defense shelters, the stockpiles were destroyed or left to rot, and the whole program faded into obscurity. I spent months trying to find anyone who had actually eaten these crackers during the Cold War. Most of the scientists involved were long dead, but I eventually tracked down a woman named Patricia van der Heide, who had been a civil defense coordinator in Wisconsin during the 1960s. She was 91 years old when I interviewed her, but her memory was sharp. She told me about the day a truck arrived at her office with thousands of these crackers in metal drums. She was instructed to distribute them to fallout shelters across the county, but she was also told something else, something that stayed with her for 60 years. The regional director pulled her aside and said, "If this ever really happens, if the bombs fall and people are trapped in these shelters, these crackers will keep them alive longer than they'll want to be alive." She didn't understand what he meant at the time, but years later she realized he was talking about the psychological horror of surviving when everything else is gone. The crackers solved the biological problem of survival, but they couldn't solve the existential problem of what you survive for. That haunted me. It still does. But here's what I've come to understand. The real power of this 37-cent meal isn't just that it can keep you alive in an emergency. It's that knowing you have it, knowing you could survive independently if you had to, changes how you move through the world. You stop being afraid. You stop making decisions based on scarcity and panic. You start thinking long-term because you've created a foundation that can't be easily shaken. Now let me tell you exactly how to make these crackers, because if you're serious about reclaiming your independence, you need to understand not just what they are, but how to produce them yourself. This isn't complicated, but every detail matters. The government spent millions perfecting this formula, and I'm going to give you their exact specifications, refined with 3 years of my own testing and modern nutritional science. Start with Bulgur wheat. You want whole grain bulgur, specifically the coarse grind, not the fine stuff sold in grocery stores for making tabbouleh. Whole grain means you're getting the bran, the germ, all the nutrients and fiber that would normally cause regular flour to spoil. The parboiling process that creates bulgur has already deactivated the enzymes that lead to rancidity, which is why this grain can last for decades when stored properly. You can find bulk bulgur at restaurant supply stores, Middle Eastern markets, or online. Buy at least 20 pounds to start, because you'll want to produce these in batches. Next is non-fat dry milk powder. This is critical for protein and calcium. Do not use whole milk powder because the fat content will go rancid. You want pure non-fat, and preferably instant milk powder because it incorporates more easily into the dough. Again, buy this in bulk. A 5-pound bag will make several batches of crackers. The third ingredient is the most important and the trickiest. Stabilized fat. You have several options here. The government used hydrogenated vegetable shortening because it was shelf-stable and provided the caloric density they needed. You can use modern vegetable shortening like Crisco, but I prefer a more natural approach. I render beef, tallow, or lard and stabilize it with vitamin E, oil, and rosemary extract, both of which are powerful natural antioxidants. If you go this route, use 1 tablespoon of vitamin E oil and 2 tablespoons of powdered rosemary extract per pound of rendered fat. Mix thoroughly and store in a cool, dark place. Here are the exact ratios by weight. For every 3 pounds of bulgur, you need 1 pound of non-fat dry milk powder and half a pound of stabilized fat. This ratio has been tested extensively and provides the optimal balance of carbohydrates, protein, and calories for long-term survival nutrition. The process begins with grinding. Take your bulgur wheat and pulse it in a food processor or grain mill until you achieve a coarse flour consistency. You don't want powder, you want something that still has texture, like cornmeal. This usually takes about 30 seconds in a food processor. Don't overprocess or you'll end up with dust that won't bind properly. Pour your ground bulgur into a large mixing bowl. Add the non-fat dry milk powder and mix thoroughly with your hands or a large spoon. Make sure these dry ingredients are completely combined before you add the fat. This is important because once the fat is incorporated, it's much harder to ensure even distribution. Now add your stabilized fat. If you're using shortening, scoop it directly into the bowl. If you're using rendered tallow or lard, make sure it's at room temperature so it's pliable but not liquid. Work the fat into the dry mixture using your hands, squeezing and kneading until the texture resembles wet sand. This takes about 5 minutes of consistent effort. You'll know it's ready when you can squeeze a handful and it holds together, but crumbles when you break it apart. At this point, you need to add water, but this is where most people make mistakes. You want just enough water to form a stiff, cohesive dough, but not so much that it becomes sticky or wet. Start with half a cup of water for every 3 pounds of bulgur you started with. Add it slowly, mixing constantly. The dough should come together into a ball that's firm and slightly tacky, but not sticky. If it's too dry and won't hold together, add water 1 tablespoon at a time. If it's too wet, add more ground bulgur. Once your dough is ready, divide it into portions. I work with about 1 pound of dough at a time. On a clean surface lightly dusted with ground bulgur to prevent sticking, roll the dough out thin, about 1/4 inch thick. Use a rolling pin or even a wine bottle if you don't have proper equipment. The thinner you roll it, the faster it will dry and the longer it will last. But if you go too thin, it becomes fragile and breaks easily during storage. Cut the rolled dough into squares, roughly 3 inches by 3 inches. You can use a knife, a pizza cutter, or even a ruler and a sharp edge. The size doesn't matter much, but consistency helps with even baking. Place these squares on baking sheets lined with parchment paper, leaving a small gap between each one. Now comes the baking process, which is really more about drying than cooking. Preheat your oven to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. This low temperature ensures the crackers dry completely without burning. Place your baking sheets in the oven and bake for 2 hours. After 2 hours, flip each cracker over and bake for another 2 hours. The goal is to remove every bit of moisture. When they're done, the crackers should be rock hard, completely dry, and they should snap cleanly when you break them. Let them cool completely on wire racks. This is crucial. If you package them while they're still warm, condensation will form inside your storage containers and ruin everything. Give them at least 4 hours to cool at room temperature. For storage, I use mylar bags with oxygen absorbers. You can buy these online in bulk very cheaply. Place 10 to 15 crackers in each mylar bag, add a 300 cc oxygen absorber, and seal the bag using either a heat sealer or a household iron on high heat. The oxygen absorber will remove all the air from the bag, creating a vacuum seal that prevents oxidation and bacterial growth. Store these sealed bags in a cool, dark, dry place. A closet works fine. A basement is even better if it's not damp. Properly stored, these crackers will last for 20 years, possibly longer. I've tested crackers I made 3 years ago, and they're still perfect. The government's own tests showed no degradation after 50 years in controlled conditions. This is food security that outlasts you. Each cracker you've made contains approximately 150 calories. An adult needs roughly 1,200 calories per day for basic survival, which means 8 crackers per day. Do the math and you'll see how powerful this is. One batch using 3 pounds of bulgur produces about 60 crackers, which is a week and a half of food for one person. Scale that up and you can create months or years of storage for a fraction of what you'd spend on commercial emergency food. But let me tell you about the practical reality of eating these crackers, because I've lived on them for extended periods, and I want you to know what to expect. They're not delicious. They're bland. They're dense. They're very dry. You need plenty of water to eat them comfortably. Some people soak them in water for a few minutes to soften them, which works well and actually makes them more digestible. You can also crumble them into hot water to make a porridge-like mixture that's easier to consume. The first few days of eating nothing but these crackers is an adjustment. Your body is used to variety, 2 flavors, to the dopamine hits of processed food. But after 3 or 4 days, something shifts. Your digestion stabilizes. Your energy becomes steady instead of spiking and crashing. Your mind clears because you're not dealing with the inflammation and blood sugar chaos that comes from modern eating. There's something almost meditative about reducing food to pure function, about stripping away all the emotional and cultural baggage we attach to eating. I've tested these crackers during deliberate fasting periods, during hiking trips where I needed lightweight nutrition, and during personal challenges where I wanted to prove to myself that I could survive on minimal resources. Every time, they've performed exactly as designed. The government knew what they were doing. This formula works. Now, I need to address something important. I've given you the knowledge to create long-term food security for pennies on the dollar, but food is only part of the equation. Real independence means controlling your health as well. That's why I've spent months researching and documenting the most powerful medicinal plants you can grow in your own backyard. Plants that treat infections, reduce inflammation, support immune function, and handle dozens of common health issues without needing a pharmacy or a prescription. That complete guide is waiting for you in the first link in the description. If you're serious about taking control of your family's well-being, you need both pieces of this puzzle. The real test of these crackers came for me last year during the supply chain disruptions that hit my area. Grocery store shelves were empty for weeks. Delivery trucks weren't coming. People were panic buying everything they could find, fighting over the last packages of rice and pasta. I watched it all with a strange sense of calm because I knew I had 6 months of these crackers in my basement, along with stored water and other supplies. That knowledge fundamentally changed how I approached the crisis. While my neighbors were stressed and afraid, I was observing, taking notes, learning about just how fragile our system really is. I wasn't worried about running out of food because I had already solved that problem. I had created independence, and that's what these crackers really represent. They're not just emergency food, they're a psychological foundation. They're proof that you don't have to depend on the system, that you can take care of yourself and your family no matter what happens. This is what the government understood during the Cold War but chose not to share widely. Independence isn't about having the most supplies, or the biggest bunker, or the most guns. It's about having a foundation solid enough that you can weather disruptions without losing your mind, without making desperate decisions, without being at the mercy of whoever controls the supply chain. These 37-cent crackers represented that foundation. They were designed for absolute worst-case scenarios, nuclear war and total social collapse, which meant they were more than adequate for any lesser crisis you might face. I want to be completely transparent with you about costs because that's part of what makes this so revolutionary. Right now, at current bulk prices, you can produce these crackers for approximately 40 to 50 cents per day of food. Let me break that down specifically. 20 pounds of Bulgur wheat costs about $25. 7 pounds of non-fat dry milk powder costs about $30. 3 pounds of stabilized fat, whether shortening or rendered tallow, costs about $10. That's $65 in raw ingredients, which produces enough crackers to feed one person for roughly 90 days. That works out to just over 70 cents per day. Compare that to the average American who spends $15 to $20 per day on food, and you begin to see why this knowledge threatens the established order. If people knew they could create their own food security for pennies, if they understood they could be completely independent of the grocery stores and the supply chains and the government programs, entire industries would face an existential crisis overnight. The formula I've given you is based directly on the declassified specifications from Project Food Packet, but I've refined it based on modern nutritional science and 3 years of personal testing. The original government crackers had some drawbacks. They were extremely hard, which made them difficult to eat without good teeth. They lacked certain micronutrients that we now know are essential for long-term health, particularly vitamin C and certain B vitamins. So I made modifications that I want to share with you. First, I add a small amount of sea salt to the dry mixture, roughly 1 tablespoon per 3 pounds of bulk. This provides iodine and essential trace minerals that support thyroid function and overall health. Second, I include a powdered multivitamin blend that I mix into the dry ingredients before adding the fat. You can buy these vitamin powders online, and just a quarter cup per batch ensures you're getting vitamins A, C, D, E, and the full B complex. This doesn't affect the shelf life at all, because quality vitamin powders are already designed to be stable for years. Third, I've experimented extensively with baking temperatures and times to achieve a texture that's hard enough to last decades, but not so hard that you risk dental damage. The sweet spot I've found is exactly what I described earlier, 250 degrees for 4 hours total with one flip halfway through. This produces a cracker that's genuinely hard, but will break cleanly when you apply pressure, rather than shattering like glass or requiring a hammer. I've also tested flavor variations, though I want to be clear that adding any fresh ingredients compromises the shelf life. If you're making these for immediate use, within 6 months to a year, you can add dried herbs like oregano, thyme, or rosemary to the dry mixture. You can also add garlic powder or onion powder. These don't significantly affect storage life if they're completely dry. But if you want maximum shelf life measured in decades, stick to the basic formula without additions. The government kept this secret not because it didn't work, but precisely because it worked too well. They understood that a population that can feed itself independently is a population that's harder to control, harder to manipulate through fear of scarcity, harder to corral into compliance when crisis hits. Every time you hear about food shortages or supply chain problems or inflation driving up grocery prices, remember that there's an alternative. It's been sitting in declassified documents all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for people brave enough to reclaim the knowledge that was deliberately buried. I keep coming back to something Patricia told me during our interview, the woman who distributed these crackers to fallout shelters across Wisconsin in the 1960s. She said that after the Cold War ended and the threat of nuclear annihilation faded, she tried to tell people about the crackers, about the program, about what the government had developed. Nobody wanted to hear it. They were relieved the threat had passed, and they didn't want to think about survival anymore. They wanted to return to normalcy, to trust that the system would take care of them, to forget that independence was even possible. But Patricia knew better. She kept her own supply of crackers, hidden in her basement in metal drums, and she told me she still has some that are over 50 years old. She opened one of those containers for me, broke the seal that hadn't been touched since 1967, and the crackers inside looked and smelled perfectly fine, slightly darker than fresh ones, but structurally sound. No mold, no rancidity, no degradation. That's when I truly believed. That's when I understood this wasn't theory or prepper fantasy, but proven technology that works exactly as designed. This 37-cent meal is real. The formula is real. The decades of shelf life are real. The independence it represents is real. The only question now is what you're going to do with this information. You can dismiss it, you can file it away as interesting but irrelevant, you can tell yourself you'll get to it someday, or you can take action right now. You can order the ingredients, you can spend one afternoon making your first batch. You can start building the foundation of independence that will serve you and your family for decades to come. And here's what I want you to do next. If this information has been valuable to you, if this story has opened your eyes to what's possible, I need you to subscribe to this channel right now. Click that subscribe button because what I'm doing here goes far beyond talking about crackers. I'm systematically documenting every piece of forgotten technology, every suppressed technique, every system of independence that's been buried by time and deliberate neglect. This channel is about taking back the knowledge that was stolen from us, one video at a time. The 37-cent meal is just the beginning. There are dozens of other programs, other formulas, other secrets from the Cold War era and beyond that are waiting to be rediscovered. Government projects that solved problems we're still struggling with today. Techniques for water purification, for energy independence, for medical self-sufficiency, for communication when the grid goes down. I'm finding every single one of them, testing them, documenting them, and sharing them with people like you who understand that independence matters. Every video I make is a piece of that puzzle, and together we're assembling something powerful. We're building a community of people who refuse to be dependent, who refuse to be afraid, who are learning the skills and knowledge that our grandparents took for granted but that have been systematically erased from modern life. When you subscribe, you're joining that community. You're saying that you value self-reliance over convenience, knowledge over ignorance, independence over compliance. The world we live in is more fragile than most people realize. The systems we depend on are held together with optimism and debt, and when they fail suddenly and catastrophically. But you don't have to be a victim of that failure. You can prepare, you can learn. You can build your own foundation of independence, starting with something as simple as a cracker that costs 37 cents and lasts for decades. That's not paranoia. That's not extremism. That's wisdom. That's taking responsibility for your own survival and your own future. That's understanding that the government, the corporations, the system itself will never prioritize your well-being over their own interests. The only person who will truly look out for you and your family is you, and the only way to do that effectively is through knowledge and skills that can't be taken away. So subscribe right now. Join us, be part of this movement to reclaim independence. And while you're at it, go check out that guide on medicinal plants in the first link of the description. Because controlling your food and your health are the two foundational pillars of real freedom. Everything else builds on top of those. The 37-cent meal that the government kept secret since the Cold War is yours now. The formula is in your hands. The knowledge is yours to use. What you do with it will determine whether you're just a consumer waiting to be supplied, or whether you're something more, something the system never wanted you to become. Truly independent, truly free, truly capable of surviving and thriving no matter what the future brings. This is your choice. This is your moment. Make it count.